these are my reflections following my undertaking the peer observation process. Please note that the peer observation form itself has been uploaded as a separate document within the portfolio. So in terms of the use of Prezi, first of all, to present my reflections, I would just point out that I like the visual aspect and prefer this over sort of PowerPoint. I would make the point, however, that it is not ideal that the manner in which that the audio has been recorded on this presentation potentially could make it look quite unprofessional, and that this is something that I need to explore further and consider in terms of if I do use Prezi in the future. The PowerPoint sessions, presentations that I have produced in the past have always been linked to Camtasia, which I have used frequently throughout my sort of projection of my lectures and so forth. So this is something that I need to consider. In terms of my reflections, I will start by running through, I suppose really, in terms of looking at this as an uphill battle, where I sort of started with the process of reflection and considering the framework for reflection, and then the summit which I have reached at the top there is essentially focusing in on the strategies that I have identified in order to enhance my ability to teach my distance learning students, and in particular to ensure that I provide them with the necessary support that they need to sort of learn in an effective manner. So just by starting off by thinking about a framework, Jenny Moon refers to the framework that's been produced by Hatton and Smith, and I think this is a very useful framework and one which it's one that I can identify with. Now, when I finished the session, the online session, I was able to sort of engage in what I now recognise to be quite descriptive writing and quite descriptive reflection. My immediate thoughts and therefore the points that I noted were that I provided a clear structure and that I had not overrun on the session, and actually that was the first time that happened, that I'd actually finished on time. And also I had realised that I had been quite frustrated with a lack of student participation. And I concluded that was basically because my students had probably been quite unprepared. And I recognised then that I moved on to what would be described as dialogic reflection, having stepped away from events and the immediacy of the situation. I considered how I had been quite tired, and that I had done the best that I could in engaging those students, and really getting them to try and engage and to answer questions. And then in fact, I started then to think about how my next session with them could be different. I had made reference to the fact that I was expecting my students to engage and hoping that this would be taken on board by the students, and that the next session would be one that would be more interactive, as I measured the success of my teaching on how much interaction came from the learners, and with points such as did they get the questions right. So when met with quite a lot of silence, I recognised that I had become frustrated, and that I was tired at the end of a long day, which may well have affected this. I've always made notes in terms of my reflections on my teaching, and I sort of naturally started doing so, and I have always found it very useful to do so, and to make notes in a notebook. Now, I think that when considering the next aspect, which is critical reflection, that there is quite a lot that needs to be taken into account in terms of critical reflection, and one of the things that I find that I sometimes lack is the time in terms of how this critical reflection should come about. One of the things that I think is particularly important to consider is whether we should just reflect when things go right, or when things go wrong. And I think this is an important question that I have to ask myself, because I find that I naturally tend to reflect when things go wrong, or things don't go as well as I would expect. When things do go to plan, and when I've had successful teaching sessions, I've sort of given myself a pat on the back and moved on quite quickly. Now, I do know that there is a lot to be learnt from when things go right, and one of the things that I've just referred to is that I do keep a journal. I recognise that this is really important for second order reflection, which is something that Jenny Moon considers, and that in actual fact, by using a journal, I can come back to my reflections and then sort of create a double entry, with a vertical split of the page, and sort of by coming back to the reflections that I have created, it just helps with that sort of deeper reflection, which many of the academics who talk about reflective practice refer to. Now, in terms of Warwick, he talks about, in his note on reflective practice, which he put together, which he compiled, that John Dewey refers to reflection as being linked to problem solving, and I think that my experience as a solicitor has meant that I often reflect on problems, and that solving problems is really important to me, and my ability to be able to do that does, I think, need me to also reflect when things go right, and to take away the positives, and not just simply focus on the negatives. One of my other reflections, which I'd like to share with you, is that I have been at times baffled by the sheer amount of theories on reflection, and I actually found the sort of distinction that Warwick refers to when he's talking about Schoen's ideas on reflection somewhat confusing, and also I didn't particularly gain anything from this sort of distinction that's been made between reflection and action, as opposed to reflection in action, nor did I particularly identify with Warwick's discussion of the 5 temporal dimensions of reflection, which refer to rapid reflection, prepare and review. And although Griffiths and Ten argues that teachers need to reflect in all of these different dimensions, there's some others there that I've just not included because they didn't sort of have any meaning for me. I still think that you can sort of get lost in the theory of reflection, and the important thing to do is find a framework which you can identify with, in the way that I have with Jenny Moon's reference in the earlier part of this presentation. Now, one of the things I did realise was that I needed to build on that framework to something which essentially incorporated some examples of good practice, and also which tied in with a number of the requirements of the UK PSF. So, typical examples being, and just referring to code A1, V1, A2, A4, and even K2. So, in terms of the UK PSF and how I relate to it, I constantly have in the back of my mind the dimensions of the framework, and I think about not only the professional values, but the areas of activity and the core knowledge. Now, Pollard's framework of reflective practice does, I think, incorporate some really good examples of professional practice, and the characteristics which are referred to actually incorporate 7 particular characteristics which should be sort of, quite integral to a reflection model. I have, however, out of the 7, picked out 4 particular characteristics which I think are particularly important and which also help to frame my reflection by giving me sort of practical ideas as to the sorts of things that I should be reflecting on. So the 4 characteristics that are listed there are the ones which I have found particularly useful. So open-mindedness, responsibility and wholeheartedness. Open-mindedness obviously referring to a desire to listen to more ideas, and also to give full attention to alternative possibilities. And I think that's such an important part of reflecting, recognising that that there is more to learn and that there are other possibilities. Cycle of monitoring, evaluating and revision. Another important one, which I think really refers to the fact that we need to continuously monitor and evaluate how we are practicing, and that we need to sort of research and monitor our own work. The next one, collaboration and dialogue with colleagues, is particularly important as well, and obviously sits quite well with the peer observation activity. But obviously reflective teaching is going to be full of dialogue with colleagues and collaboration between faculty. And I think there's so much for us to learn from our colleagues, and we should be sharing best practice. So that one I think is an important characteristic. The last one is creative mediation of externally developed frameworks. And I think here where it refers to Pollard referring to the reflective teachers being able to justify protective mediation to defend existing practices, and engage in innovative mediation by working within the spaces and boundaries provided by new requirements, and contributing to a collaborative mediation whereby externally developed ideas are scrutinised and adapted in a mutual, in a professional, mutually supportive environment. And I think that ability to innovate and collaborate is particularly important, and thinking, and forgive the cliche of saying thinking outside the box, but I think that this is something that is particularly important as well. So that's the framework which I have found to be the most useful in terms of my own reflective practice. So, in terms of where that leaves me, well, as I have identified myself to be very much a pragmatist, I'm always sort of considering what I can change, and what I can learn, which will actually which would then help me with my work and enhance the student learning experience. So I just wanted to finish off my reflections by running through, now that I feel that I have reached the top of the summit, some of the points that I have come up with as to how I could improve my distance learning teaching in particular. Now, one of the things that my colleague who observed my session referred to was the fact that it wasn't clear how many students were in the class. And although I had anonymised the participants list by putting it into the presenter area, which I understood has always been best practice to preserve the anonymity of the students, I can, on reflection, see how that might cause a problem, because I'm not helping to develop a sense of a learning community amongst my learners. Some of the literature which I've referred to has identified that we often don't provide sessions which are, for example, just there to be an icebreaker. That I have not undertaken an icebreaker session with my distance learning students, which is not really helpful, as I said, in terms of encouragement of this building up of a learning community, and for my students to sort of collaborate and work with one another. I think that there are some basic ways in which this could be incorporated into a new cohort's initial induction, and there are various methods. So, for example, using a Kingdomality profiler or a VARK learning styles type questionnaire, just to discuss possibilities and generate dialogue. So that's something that I think my learners could benefit from next time. Also, one of the key things I've thought about is the fact that my students are obviously, well, a lot of them are international, not all of them, but because of where they are in the world, they're actually affected by being in completely different time zones, and I think that I should sort of be more aware of who they are, where they come from. Really, the only reason I know that one of my students was in Pakistan was by the fact that he said to me that he was retired and that he had just returned from dinner, which was strange because then I realised what the time was of the session and how that compared. But I think that it's important that I do know where my students are based, and also know their names in the same way that I would make the effort to learn the names of my students who are in the live classroom in front of me. I didn't use a webcam because of a failure in IT, unfortunately, which meant that the session was recorded on a desktop. So that, I appreciate that does not help the learning experience, and that students do want to see my facial expressions as well as hearing my voice. So that's something that I would entirely agree would need to be remedied for another session. And I also think that it would be helpful to create some sort of forum or sort of live chat via something like Office Communicator amongst my students. I do encourage them to chat before and after their recordings, and I always ask them questions, but I think recording the sessions, which we're required to do, does make it quite difficult for them to sort of interact with each other on a more informal basis. In terms of why my students were not participating, I think that although my colleague observed that I had used polls, and she thought that my use of polls was a real positive, as was the use of the tick and cross boxes and the raising and disagreeing of the hands to show understanding. I think that student participation could be better and would be if I approach the session in the same way as I would my live session. So I've often found that students who are quieter just need to be not confronted with, but sort of become more comfortable by sort of speaking to colleagues in a sort of a familiar or a smaller, less threatening environment, and that this could be created on the distance learning course by the use of breakout rooms. I have now undertaken some basic training on breakout rooms, and I'm going to be sort of trialling this to see how it works. There are certain complications, I understand, to do with how you bring in whiteboards and bring them back into the main room, and how you monitor conversations and that kind of thing, and how you split up groups. So some work to be done on that aspect. In terms of the point I was making earlier about increasing the students' ability, I think that one of the problems is that there are actually too many participants in the session. Although the sessions have been split now so that there are actually two groups of distance learning students on this particular day, it still appears that there are too many students. Institutional constraints mean that there's not a lot I can do about this. I do, however, make sure that I give my students my email address, and I have found that actually students have come back and asked questions and emailed me. But I think that also using, sort of a more interactive sort of forum where questions can be posted, probably on something like Moodle, would work quite well. Although I appreciate that it could become quite time-consuming, constantly monitoring it. And having to respond to it. I do have a colleague who teaches on the distance learning programme as well, so potentially we could between us deal with any such queries, and also monitor and encourage the students to provide answers to each other's questions. The other thing that I considered might be useful was to give the students more rights. So I don't know exactly how this would work, and it's something that I need to look into, but so for example that they can use the whiteboard and make the session more interactive. In a class I would get my students just to get up and write on the whiteboard, so I need to think about how I could maybe, by changing the permissions which they have been automatically set up with, sort of give them more rights to sort of engage them and increase the activity. I do think listening to an online session, it can be quite tedious, and I do think that I do speak too much. So that is something that I need to think about. Now, the other thing is that having read an online teaching manifesto